Today on TimesCast, former Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic, known for organizing the massacre of some 8,000 Muslim men and boys at Srebrenica in 1995, has been captured in Serbia.
Bosnian Serb war crime suspect Ratko Mladic was arrested this morning in Belgrade after 15 years of evading arrest. He was the big fish. He was the biggest obstacle to Serbia joining the European Union. He was one of the most wanted men in Europe. In the European context, he was a bin Laden-like character. Myself and my colleague Doreen Carvajal spent 6 months or so investigating for Ratko Mladic in Serbia, Bosnia, and all across the Balkans. During the last several years, investigators found home videos of Mr. Mladic showing him attending weddings, hanging out with his family. These videos suggested that in the early years of his hiding, he was at least living pretty openly, although in contained circumstances. They found him after a tip-off that a gentleman who resembled Mr. Mladic was living in this small town about 120 miles north of Belgrade. Police went to the house, which reportedly belonged to relatives of Mr. Mladic. He was operating under an alias, and they went and arrested him. It marks a seminal moment in the hunt for one of the world's most wanted war criminals. Serbia is at a critical moment, already in the process of joining the European Union. Mladic was the biggest stumbling block. It was seen as a moral imperative that they must bring Mladic, who was responsible for the worst massacre since the Second World War, to justice, and that without this step, Serbia would not be able to join the European Union. What's interesting is that today, apparently he did not resist arrest and was very cooperative. Mladic has a very strong warrior code, and most people thought that if the police closed in on him, he would kill himself or his close associates would try and kill him. So it's interesting that police are saying in Serbia that he appeared to be resigned, frail, and handed himself over willingly.
Given all that's happened since 2001, the war in Bosnia is ancient history for a lot of people. At the time, it was this startling example of General Mladic leading a professional army in an unprovoked attack on Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. And he took, for the first time, a professional army and had it use its tanks and artillery and its well-trained snipers to kill civilians openly and intentionally. That had never occurred before. And it produced a lot of condemnations from the United States and the United Nations, but no serious action. And he just grew bolder and bolder as time went on, flouting the international community. And the real culmination was finally the fall of this town of Srebrenica, which I wrote about extensively at the time, where Mladic's soldiers rounded up 8,000 men and boys, told them they wouldn't be harmed, then bussed them to open fields and summarily executed them. There were mass graves all around Srebrenica, and when Mladic's forces realized that they were being discovered, they then dug up the graves, lumped all these bodies together in this sort of macabre jigsaw puzzle, trucked the body parts to new sites, and then dug new graves. To this day, there are thousands of mass execution victims who haven't been identified. I would say more than any other figure, Mladic created the darkest chapter in UN history and one of the darkest moments in Clinton's presidency. The fact that the United States was so slow to act during the war weakened President Bill Clinton, and the fact that Mladic was able to stay free for 16 years after the war ended was humiliating also for the United States, and particularly for Europe. European countries said they would hold him accountable, they would bring stability to the Balkans, and it's taken them this long to finally bring Mladic to justice. I spoke to a survivor from Srebrenica earlier today, a young man whose father, mother, and brother were all executed by Mladic's forces. He's not filled with joy today. His point is, how could this man have lived with impunity for 16 years after carrying out Europe's worst massacre since World War II?
I covered the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995 and first met General Ratko Mladic in Belgrade in 1992. I walked into a very smoky room. All rooms in Belgrade were smoky at that time. And there was Mladic in full Serbian uniform. He was smoking a cigarette. He was in expansive mood. He was telling me about all the terrible things inflicted on the Serbs throughout history, particularly by the Croats. And one of the peculiarities of the Bosnian War throughout was that the Serbs were so, with Mladic in the lead of this, so blinded by the historical injustices, particularly during World War II, that they believed, rightly in some instances, had been perpetrated against the Serbs, that they couldn't see that the fact that this time around they were the main perpetrators rather than the victims. Mladic wouldn't hear anything of the disappearance of Muslims, some 750,000 of whom were moved from their homes in the first 9 months of the war, tens of thousands of whom disappeared. He wouldn't admit any of that. He was completely blind to it. He would accept no responsibility. And he insisted that Serbs were just fighting to stay on land that had been Serbian throughout history. In the end, he charmed many people, including many NATO generals. General Wesley Clark was famously pictured beside him wearing a Serbian army hat. And he responded to the efforts of NATO and the UN, the confused efforts of NATO and the UN during 3 years, by being forceful. Nevertheless, Mladic remained for many years a heroic figure within Serbia. And I think it took these 15 plus years for Serbian society to become sufficiently stable for the arrest of Mladic to be possible without an explosion of that very divided society.